Thanks,
Cool.
everyone. All right. Hi, everyone. For those of you who I have not met before, I am Rebecca Sumeta Edmonds, and I am the director of the National Center on Intensive Intervention. You may know many of my colleagues who you may see out in the field a little more often these days. I have been involved with NCII since its inception back in 2011 and was previously a part of the RTI Center as it was named back in those early days. Um, so have been involved in this work for a very long time and spend a lot of my time thinking about these problems. So I'm happy to be here with you today and would love to hear from you as we're talking through as well. So for today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about, why we should even care about fidelity, also some of the things that maybe make it hard. And then we will branch off a little bit and speak about database individualization, which is our approach to intensive intervention. And the reason I wanted to introduce that is that I think it also creates with it a bit of a different way of thinking about elements of fidelity and particularly different elements of fidelity during different stages of the process. And then I will talk through some thoughts that I've had in terms of sort of five considerations for thinking about fidelity within the DBI process. But again, I think some of these things may be applied in other areas. And then we'll also have some time for just some discussion toward the end. So with that, we are going to take a moment and use a Mentimeter to create a word cloud about sort of what comes to your mind when you think about fidelity. This could be what does it mean? What's good about it? What's bad about it? What's hard about it? Um, and if you can take a moment and put in three responses for yourself. And there should be both a link in the chat from John or the QR code.
That's right. And if you'll do me a favor and enter the three words separately, that'll make sure that they show up as individual words. So,
And we'll just take 2 or 3 minutes for people to go ahead and do that.
and while people are doing that, I'll go ahead and fill the airwaves a minute. I always think of stereo, high fidelity stereo, right? That you want the recording to sound just as good as the
Yep,
live.
yep, yep. All right, it looks like it may be settling in here. So seeing a lot of spaces, sort of focusing on consistency. It's obviously a really critical practice as we think about the broader implementation and making sure we're doing what we said we're going to do. Um, but I'm also noticing some points about, complicated, correct, success, so the kind of things that may kind of get at some of the perceptions people have about it or the reasons that it may or may not be something that gets done as often as we might like. Okay. I'll come back. Let's see if I can make this work again without too much complication. Let's see here. There we go. Now I'm showing no. Okay. I'm gonna. All right. We should be back having this look the way it's supposed to. So if it is not,
Uh,
please.
you haven't started your share yet, actually,
Oh, wait.
Rebecca.
I didn't. Okay. I'm so sorry, you guys. This is not cooperating with me today. Screen sharing has failed to start. All right, let's try this again. Share. Okay, now we will go back and make it a slideshow. And
Looks perfect.
okay, man, you guys, this is not my best moment with the slide deck this morning. Um, so, why should we worry about fidelity? Obviously, I think I'm talking to a lot of people who are doing this work and know that there's a lot that we should care about in terms of making sure the programs are implemented with fidelity. I also would like to pause and say I want to acknowledge that we are living through a very challenging time and not knowing the future of a lot of these federal investments. And I know that that is also hard and very much weighing on people's minds. But that being said, we've lived through a time where there have been a lot of federal investments in these things, in these different projects that are about promoting a more effective MTSS and special education practices over the past 2 decades. Yet we still see persistent challenges for for students who are at risk or who have disabilities, across areas of academic achievement, behavioral outcomes, graduation, employment rate, and employment outcomes. We know that these data are pretty stagnant, if not declining, in the post-COVID era. And also just that schools are really challenged when it comes to implementing evidence-based practices. I think many know it's a good idea, but they find it difficult for a lot of reasons. Um, and kind of hand in hand with that, MTSS itself as a system seems to be very difficult for schools to implement. It's complex, it's got a lot of layers. And we're doing that against a backdrop of heavy teacher burnout, per- administrator burnout, and challenges recruiting into the field. And so that, all of this sort of rolls up to make us think like we've created a system that is actually pretty hard to do. And so how could we think about looking at our practices and what we're doing and using it to not only identify what is working, but also what are the features that we really should keep and what are some of the things that perhaps we could let go of? Um, and so that's sort of the way I'm hoping we can think about some of this as we're moving forward in this hour is, fidelity is important with respect to, figuring out if the things we know that work are being when we apply them at scale and they don't work, is it because we didn't actually fully implement the process of the system? But I would also add we maybe need to be asking ourselves, have we created something that is so complex that it's actually not possible to implement it with fidelity? Um, and I think that we are seeing elements of that in some of the challenges that schools encounter when they're actually trying to make some of these processes work. So, with this in mind, like if you have a moment and take and put in the chat, what for you, what are some of the reasons that you see that schools struggle to monitor fidelity? Or do you find that they struggle to monitor? And if so, why? I should have said that a little differently.
And Rebecca, I'll go ahead and throw out the if people would like to come off mute and
Hmm.
talk, that would be appropriate too.
Yeah, absolutely. It may be if it's easier to do that, that's fine. No, I sometimes think like when we do kind of look at people's implementation of these kind of systems, sometimes fidelity, it kind of comes at the end of the list, and there's a lot of nodding that yes, we should do it, but we're not doing it. Um, Maybe it feels a little bit like flossing your teeth at night or other habits you should do, but you don't always track. Do you have a sense about that in the schools or the sites where you're working that or is this part of their practice or is this something that they are challenged with?
Oh, sorry, I'll turn on my camera.
Yeah.
This is Mark from Wisconsin. Yeah, I would say that it needs to be very purposeful and explicit because I feel like it can be kind of an afterthought, just
Hmm.
like evaluation in general is
Hmm.
often thought of as an afterthought. Um, and I think we do build it in from the very beginning, like that there's an expectation and an understanding on the part of the participants that the the quality, the fidelity of the implementation is crucial to getting out the
Hmm.
outcomes that we want. So, yeah, I think just being explicit and having it as, you know, uh, integral to the program itself is really
Hmm.
important.
Hmm. Absolutely. Any other shot thoughts for people to want to share?
This is Stacy, from New York. My video, I'm having problems with my video. There I
Oh,
am.
there you are.
I'm having third world problems. My other videos are not working. What you shared, Mark, even when you make it explicit, I find that some of the schools in my pilot struggle to realize the importance of fidelity. And Leslie shared because they don't prioritize it, which is true. I find that a lot of my admins or my educational stakeholders, they're putting out fires, putting out fires, putting out fires. And even if you tell them that like their investment in this process will help them to not put out fires. They just don't have time for it. So it's the time, competing priorities, and like just taking the time to engage in these reflective exercises. They just think it's just too much investment. So,
Hmm.
one of the things that we're struggling with is how do we impress upon them, right, the importance, Mark, not from a compliance standpoint, saying that you signed this, therefore you should do this because then nothing's going to happen, but how do we garner buy-in for them to see the importance of this measure to actually deal with a lot of the fires that they're putting out?
Yep, I think those are really important points, especially against the backdrop of everything on the plates, especially of I mean, educators for sure, and I would say in particular administrators, the number of things that they're being asked to do in a given day. Sometimes it's difficult for them to, I think, be able to take pause and think about these things, even if they may recognize intellectually that they're important. Any other comments before we move on? So before we jump into the components of or some the kind of thoughts about fidelity along different stages of the DBI process, I just wanted to um, put this slide up here in case you are somebody who maybe does not work as closely at that sort of tier three or intensive intervention level within your projects. But DBI, or database individualization, is our center's approach to intensive intervention. It's a research validated process for individualizing and intensifying an intervention. It's really the concept is really, how do you know when and how to move from a tier two or a standardized intervention program or platform to something that's more intensive, and how do you, what are the steps that may take? So you might think of that first orange box at the top as really being what might be the tier two program that as any student who's identified as at risk may receive support in. And it goes with, the assumption is that you are conducting some kind of progress monitoring for students at that stage. And if it's working and they're responsive, we continue and we work with continuing the validated program and monitoring progress. And where intensive intervention really starts to take off is for students where the progress monitoring data are suggesting that they're not responsive to that tier two or standardized platform. So where do you go from here? Do you throw out the program? Do you try something different? Do you make adjustments and so forth? And so the next stage of that process is really looking not only at the progress monitoring data, but your diagnostic data. So that may be it could be in some cases where formal assessments have been collected, those information may inform diagnostic data, but we also would talk about it in a broader sense where it's really sort of informal data sources. So this may be student work samples, this may be error analysis of progress monitoring data, this may be interim assessments that are part of um, a part of an instructional program or classroom assessment that happens along the course of daily instruction. So those, pointing to those data, also on the behavioral side, it may be information about kind of the identifying function of behavior setting events, what seems to be the kind of the antecedents when behavior may be occurring and so forth. But then the idea is that we use that information to identify potentially productive changes or adaptations to the program that then we apply to the platform when it's appropriate. There may be times where we may just decide to make a change to the platform, but in many or most cases, we would continue with the platform and make some kind of adjustment based on what we've learned from the diagnostic data. We would continue to collect progress monitoring data and then um, make additional adjustments if it's not sufficient, or continue with the successful adaptation and monitoring of progress. So that's sort of our approach to database individualization. Many of you may know it as experimental teaching. It has a long history in the research literature that dates back to University of Minnesota and Stan Dino and Phyllis Merkin, and has been researched over the last several decades in many different capacities. Um, Before I go any farther, I wanted to pause and just see if there was any questions about this. I know many of you are likely familiar with it. Okay. So, given that by design, the DBI process is actually sort of offering you permission to not implement something with Fidelity. I wanted to take some time to to talk through sort of 5 things that might be worth thinking about in how you talk about or consider supporting sites in monitoring fidelity if they are trying to implement something like DBI. So the first is that, in that first stage, the most important thing is to just to do it, to implement the program as it's designed, and make sure that you're doing the components that as they're laid out, you're following the schedule, that you've had sufficient duration, and so forth. So this is probably the most standard way we think about fidelity is that notion of adhering to the program. And if it doesn't work, the questions to ask then also become some of those ones that we're probably all the most familiar with. Did the student actually get the intervention? Were they at school? Was the implementation schedule appropriate given the recommendations of the developer or publisher? Was there sufficient time for the intervention? Again, like if it's a program designed to be implemented for 30 minutes 3 times a week and we're doing it twice a week for 10 minutes, we probably can't be surprised that the intervention is not working. Also questions about how's the rest of the group that the students receiving the intervention with doing? Is everybody not responding, or is it just one student? Again, that tells us something different about what individual needs may be. The question about it, does it align with student needs? Sometimes there is a tendency in schools, especially schools where there may be a predetermined set of approved programs at different tiers. That sometimes students get a program because it's the one that's available in reading for that grade level and not because it's the area of reading that they need the support in. So, asking that kind of question about, are we actually implementing a program that's appropriate for the needs? And then this last one is, what are the barriers to implementation if present? So handing a teacher a program that's designed to be implemented 3 times a week for 30 minutes when she has 10 minutes twice a week is a recipe for fidelity to be poor. So if there's a barrier to implementation, what do we need to do to address that? Are there things in the context or the setting we can change? Or do we need to ask if this is the right intervention? And do we need to figure out something that is simpler or some combination? But, if we're putting things into a system that are more complex or involved than the system is prepared to receive, we probably can't be surprised that fidelity continues to be low, or that people resist measuring it because they're having challenges with feeling the success with that. If you're interested in a nice kind of heartwarming story, I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to take the time to show the video today, just given the time that we have. But there's a nice video that I've linked to here from the state of Wyoming, that we worked with intensively, that really got at this point. It tells a broader set of stories, but one of the things I thought was really compelling here was one of the things that the schools we worked with committed to doing early was literally picking a tier two and actually just using it and committing to using it consistently. And they saw very quickly, actually, impressive growth among some of their lowest performing students of like 7 or 8 achievement points on on reading outcome measures. And so, it really just reinforced that notion that sometimes the simple fix is the answer. Is that we said we were doing a program, we didn't do it. So figuring out how do we set the conditions to make sure that those programs can be implemented the way they're designed. And if not, figuring out what we need to change. So that's sort of step one, is that first sort of standard um, question. And then this is probably a somewhat familiar set of concepts for you about thinking about the elements of fidelity. And in that, we student engagement, adherence, program specificity, quality of delivery, exposure, and duration. Those are often the 5 elements we talk about when we talk about the big picture of fidelity. But the thing that often gets measured is adherence, right? And this is, when we think about fidelity checklists and ask about components of the program, we're often most interested in seeing, did they do part one, part two, part three, right? And while that is probably necessary, it may not be sufficient. So again, kind of backing out of the way we're thinking about fidelity and monitoring it and asking ourselves questions about, was the student here and engaged? Was the teacher delivering it in an engaging way? Was there enough time for the program to have the impact that we would hope? And was it specific enough both in that it's different than something else and sort of discrete, but I would also add specific and appropriate for the student's needs. I think this is often a point where the sort of tier two or standard platform is not doing enough because it's actually maybe not the right program. So getting at that point of that question of sometimes doing the program, it just isn't enough. There's also the idea that some students just need more. We know from data on students with intensive learning needs that about 20% of students will not of students who are at risk will not be sufficiently responsive to standardized programs that have been shown to work for many children who are at risk, or for most children who are at risk. There are 20% that's just not going to be enough, no matter how well designed the program is. So this is the point at which you might say, okay, do we keep doing something that we know isn't enough, or do we need to make a change? Okay. So I would say that this is the kind of that point where you might say you have a permission, quote unquote, to think about fidelity a bit differently. But before we go there, I did want to go and to spend a moment talking about measurement, because this is, I think, often an underappreciated part of fidelity monitoring, and also in terms of making decisions about whether a program is effective or not. There sometimes is an assumption that the measures are what they are, and we look at the data and we keep going. Um, but if we don't pause and actually think about how we're collecting the data and whether the data we're collecting are appropriate, we can sometimes make incorrect assumptions about what needs to happen next. And frankly, there are patterns in data that could point you to issues in fidelity that are also worth considering. So first and foremost, really considering your measures at these different phases of the process. So in terms of data collection and data entry, there's some common challenges that can undermine fidelity of your broader process and your the quality of the data that you're getting, that then may also undermine the decisions you're ultimately making about whether a program's working or not. So we see challenges with inconsistent administration. And this may come from either people not being properly trained on how to implement an assessment, or they were trained a long time ago and they've had some drift in how they implement the assessment, or they have ways that they've learned that they like to do it, and that those ways are not consistent with the implementation procedures. Despite over 20 years of pretty well developed training, professional learning, and implementation of the notion of, for example, early literacy screening, we still hear from schools and teachers that say that you shouldn't measure fluency because it makes the child nervous, or you don't get a good sense of accuracy from them, or the child might get tired, so you don't get good information. Um, not recognizing the idea that fluency is actually one of the critical pieces of the measurement. And collecting data on oral reading fluency without using a timer is not going to give you the same information about their learning, and their score is not going to tell you the same information about their risk status as it using a timer to conduct the fidelity assessment as it was designed. So that's an example of a sort of an incorrect administration or a drift in administration that can really undermine the quality of assessment and give us incorrect information about what may need to be happening next. Similarly, inconsistency with how we score, or making errors in how we score can be another source of measurement error that can again undermine the quality and the fidelity of our assessment practices, give us incomplete pictures of students' level of accuracy, the kind of errors they're making, and so forth. And then along those lines, data entry errors. So if we're working in a system where we're still having to do some kind of transcription of student responses into a database of some kind, making sure that those things are done correctly. So those are kind of high level issues that may get at some fidelity challenges that are not uncommon. But then also there are patterns in data that are worth looking at and may point to problems in data collection that, again, a school site, if they're seeing these kind of patterns, may help cue them to backing up and looking more closely at these kinds of fidelity components within the assessment practice. I wanted to pause there and see if there's any comments or questions at this point. With the slides up, I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing the chat, so I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Good. Okay, so some data patterns that may indicate issues with fidelity. And I've tried to provide examples that may show what an academic chart or data pattern may look like, and also from a behavioral perspective. So flatlining or really minimal change on a progress monitoring chart. So in this example, the dotted line is the phase change, so that would indicate when an intervention change occurred. And then we see the blue goal line, and we see the students' data are essentially the same from before the intervention started to after. In this case, there's a couple of questions we could be asking ourselves about the intervention. The first may be they're not responding, and that could be the case, and that would be a fair interpretation. From a behavioral perspective, it may look something more like this, where you're seeing the pre and post intervention or phase change are very similar. So we're not yet seeing any kind of indication that what we've done is having the impact that we would hope. So what these patterns could be telling us is, number one, like I said, the student isn't responding. We need to do something else, and that is absolutely something we need to be considering. But the other things that may be worth thinking about with respect to fidelity is that we have not chosen an appropriate progress monitoring tool. Okay, especially when you see scores, and like in that academic example, that are bouncing along the bottom of the measurement instrument, it suggests that the measure may actually be too hard, and that we're not detecting change, even though the intervention is potentially having an impact, but the measurement tool we're using is not appropriate for detecting that change. That often occurs when a student is performing well below an expected grade level, or there's some kind of a policy that progress monitoring has to happen only at the grade level and not at the student's instructional level. That's when we see those kind of patterns. And I would argue that that's actually a fidelity problem, because you're not using a progress monitoring tool that is valid and reliable for making instructional decisions if it is misaligned with their current functioning. Similarly, it could be this could also point to an issue with the fidelity of the intervention delivery. Okay, so if the student is showing no change, despite a well-planned intervention adjustment or adaptation, we do have to ask the question, was the program that we changed implemented? Did the student get the sufficient duration? Did we have the follow through that we said we were going to have? When we start seeing those kind of data patterns, these are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And if the answer to this is yes, we did make the change and we implemented it the way we were supposed to, and the progress monitoring tool is appropriate, then we're left with they're not responding or this isn't appropriate for their needs and we need to change again. But we can ask these other questions first before rushing to a change. So in this case, fidelity may help us make looking at fidelity may help make the job easier rather than harder because it may help us rule out other problems before immediately switching to other answers in terms of the instructional program. So the other outcome trend pattern that you may see that might point to issues with fidelity is a highly variable trend. So where the student's performance is bouncing around from one day to the next. So in an academic graph, it may look something like this, where we're just seeing huge swings and a trend line, though, that is still underperforming the goal line. With respect to behavior, you may see, again, considerable variation in performance and no kind of change in the level of variability from pre to post intervention or phase change. And again, these patterns can tell you something about the quality of your assessment and point to issues with fidelity. So the progress monitoring tool not being reliable or not being administered in a reliable and consistent way. So if I'm seeing data trends like that, I would want to go back and look at the data collection and the extent to which we can be confident that the data were being collected, scored, and entered in a consistent and reliable fashion. And if we are again able to rule those kind of questions out, then you can ask yourselves about whether the engagement and motivation were appropriate, or whether there's other external factors that may be affecting behavior, and that could be contributing to the kind of variation that we're seeing. But again, this is an example of ruling out a problem with assessment and a problem with how we're administering and monitoring that the implementation of the assessment may help prevent us from moving to a bunch of unnecessary changes that may actually undermine what we're trying to accomplish. So number 4, and this is really where we may divert from our traditional way of thinking about fidelity, which is follow the program the way it was designed. What we're saying at this stage of the DBI process is the program the way it was designed isn't working, or it's not working well enough. We're getting a little change, but it's not sufficient. So now we need to think about monitoring progress toward our plan. We've made a well-reasoned plan using diagnostic data, progress monitoring data that are valid and reliable, and we've made kind of an educated guess or an informed hypothesis about the instructional need, and we're adapting the program based on that need. Okay, so now what we need to do is really monitor fidelity to that plan. So we're not saying continue to do the program the way it was designed, even though it's not working. We're saying now's the time to think about doing something different. Okay. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we actually have the follow through that is critical. And this is, I think, where the breakdown often occurs as we move from the tier 2 to the tier 3 and individualized programming, is that we come up with a really good idea or set of ideas for what a student may need, but then our follow through or clarity about who's responsible for follow through sometimes falls through the cracks. So we have created a number of resources at NCII for helping teachers and intervention teams both create these plans, but also monitor the follow through. for these plans. So we have a number of different data tracking forms, and I've provided some links to them if they're helpful for schools to want to use. We also are happy for schools to modify them for their own purposes if it's helpful. But the idea is that they just kind of give templates for places to initially work from in both designing plans, but then also creating the follow through for the practices. So, we implemented the intervention, but I'm sorry, we created the plan, but then we also follow through on the intervention. So, was the intervention offered the days we said it was going to be offered? It was attendance an issue. And that is, again, if when you start graphing data, this often it becomes clear very quickly um, that students are not at school a lot of the time. And that I don't necessarily mean that they're just sick or mom didn't take them to school or there's an attendance issue, but the number of disruptions to the schedule that students encounter in any given day, any given week, um, really start to add up. And a program that's designed to be administered, 4 days a week, if a student is missing an instructional group once a week due to an assembly, a snow day, a school holiday, teacher conferences, a sick day, a special event happening in a classroom. Those things add up over time and can often point to the reason that a student is missing 20 to 25% of their instructional minutes that they're supposed to be receiving. Um, and so asking this question, I think, is a really important one, and also can point to issues in the broader school schedule and sort of what are the negotiable and non-negotiable times for students to miss that are worth honing in on, particularly for kids who are receiving intervention, because this is a very common point of where implementation can fall down, and where we might, in a relatively with some creative thinking, be able to work around at least some of the things that the school has control over. Obviously, we don't have control over every snow day, but we do have control over, you know, when kids are pulled for specials or when kids are pulled for assemblies or other things like that. Um, and then I think this question for students who are struggling is, were they engaged? Do they need some kind of a behavior support plan in addition to the academic intervention, or the flip, right? If a student's experiencing behavioral challenges, are we ensuring that their academic needs are being met? Are the behavioral challenges actually occurring as a result of some kind of avoidance behavior with respect to academics? So really trying to get at that question of engagement and motivation as being part of whether or not the student is actually receiving the intervention that we've designed. And then finally, did we implement the program that we planned to? Sort of yes, no, or somewhere in the middle. And it would be fair to say that in many cases, we probably fall somewhere in the middle due to a lot of these contextual factors. Um, and then kind of with that in mind, as we back out of looking at the plan we designed and looking at whether we implemented it, being able to have a kind of a real conversation about, have we designed a plan that is implementable, right? What is it so complex that we can only do this if we have a very small student teacher ratio? Is it one that we need to think about how we can simplify and streamline? Did we make, a small number of changes at a time so we can evaluate whether they're working or not, but also so that we can determine whether they're sustainable and feasible? Okay, so um, if if we don't and if we don't think that way about designing individualized programs, I think we run the risk of having fidelity never be something that we can achieve. So I think we when we create these plans, we need to be thinking about not only could they work in a perfect world, but could they work in our context? And if they can't, what are the things that are fungible? But I would also add to that, sometimes we spend the time creating a beautiful plan, and it's hard to stop and plan for the follow-up, or we run out of time to think about the follow-up and who is responsible. So I think that it's very popular to say these students are everyone's responsibility. And that, to an extent, is very true. But if follow-up is everyone's job, it very quickly becomes no one's job. So if no one is assigned to collecting the progress monitoring data, to adjusting the schedule to make sure the student can get the program, to making sure the next meeting is planned to check in on progress, to you know, adjusting the behavior program and communicating that with the other teachers that work with the student throughout the day, these things do not happen. And so, yes, it's everybody's responsibility, but people also need to leave these planning meetings and planning events with a sense of what is happening next and what they are responsible for. And then finally, my last point is that we should be using fidelity data for continuous improvement. So it's not just to say, oh, you didn't do the program right, we caught you, but rather we didn't fully implement the program, and why was that? What do we need to change to make that possible for you to implement the program? Or are there pieces of the program that aren't worth continuing? Are we doing things that we've always done and that's the only reason we're continuing to do them? Or um, are we implementing them because they're actually helping us achieve an outcome? So I think it's very popular to think about how do we add things to our plate. And as educators, we want to add more and we want to change systems.
You kidding?
I know, I don't know anybody who's that way, but we often don't think about how do we take them off.
You know, something.
I think we've got somebody who's not maybe not muted. But anyway, so I would just suggest that in addition to using Fidelity to say what do we need to do more of, we should also be looking at Fidelity to think of what do we need to do less of? What are data sources that are not providing us the information we need and that we might be able to let go of? What are practices that are actually getting in the way of us achieving fidelity for this program or set of programs or framework that we have said that we want to prioritize, and how can we make room for that? Um, and so I think that that can often feel scary for people, but I think it's also a conversation we need to have if we are going to create systems that are feasible for schools that are being asked to do a lot to implement and be able to sustain. And so, and with that, I just would love to kind of open it up and hear from you all. You know, in your experience, why do you think people may continue to implement ineffective or counterproductive practices? Are there things that we could do to make this work, particularly as it respects to as it relates to fidelity monitoring? What can we do to make it easier to manage so that people feel like they could do it? Um, and then are there particular sets of knowledge and skills that administrators or teachers may need to develop in order to facilitate this? And I will pause and, people should feel free to respond to any of these questions that come to mind for them or any other thoughts that they're having. I just kind of put these out there to kind of get conversation juices rolling. So.
Rebecca, this is John. As you were talking, I really what I latched onto is looking at data and looking for patterns so that changes that are made aren't just kind of grabbing in the dark
Mm-hmm.
and making wholesale changes. That you can make a change based on a pattern that the data's telling you there may be a theory behind why it's not working,
Mm-hmm.
making a change systematically, and then really importantly, following up on tracking whether that change works or not, and adhering to monitoring the data. And to me, doing that in a systematic way rather than uh, throwing up wholesale changes and then having too much data to track because you've
Mm-hmm.
made too many changes leads to that drowning in data and not knowing how to
Hmm.
move forward from that point.
Absolutely.
Hi, Rebecca. It's Stacy
Hi.
again. I'm actually going to put on my school psychologist hat with
Hmm.
my director hat. And why do you think people continue to implement ineffective or counterproductive practices? Is that they're just not collecting their progress monitoring data. So they're not collecting their
Hmm.
progress monitoring data, and neither do they know how to truly engage in database decisions, right? And
Hmm.
so it's and another, so yeah, they're not doing that to then document whether or not the practice that they're engaged in is actually good practice. And it's easier to just continue and then to show up to say that the child's not making progress.
Hmm.
I know that for schools who have decided to use a response to intervention practice to identify students for special education, when teachers do come back to the planning committee and they don't have the data to support what they're saying,
Hmm.
oftentimes they're told to go back to the drawing board
Hmm.
and collect this data
Hmm.
and documentation for the student. How can making monitoring fidelity easier to manage? I was thinking oftentimes people don't really think of the progress monitoring tools that they use to monitor tier two and tier three
Hmm.
interventions. So I'm also a trainer, and when my students go in for their internship, they tend to like come up with these most amazing
Hmm.
plans for progress monitoring without really thinking about the ecosystems that are in the classroom, right? Not
Exactly.
really thinking about how many students the teacher has or how many students in the classroom are students with special needs. And so one of the things that I encourage them to really think about is, what's the day-to-day demands for the teacher?
Hmm.
When I was a practitioner back in the day, we would then can we identify self-monitoring assessments that students themselves are taking?
Hmm.
So you're better able to track the interventions that are occurring.
Hmm.
And oftentimes I would then sometimes work with principals on using their volunteers from the community, right?
Hmm.
Using their interns, their student teachers to actually collect these progress monitoring data
Hmm.
for the teachers.
Hmm.
And so, you take that off the plate.
Absolutely.
Um, and what knowledge and or skills do teachers and administrators need to facilitate this? It goes back to what Mark said earlier, like understanding the why behind why we're
Hmm.
collecting the data.
Hmm.
I'm going to say about 15 years ago, like teachers didn't know, like in-service teachers did not know how to use certain formative assessments to
Hmm.
actually PM interventions. But let's fast forward. Folks already know how to do that. So it's time and truly understanding what it means to engage in database decision making.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
I
I'll be
think along
quiet.
the lines of what you're saying too, having it be okay for like the perfect to not be the enemy of the good, right? So in an ideal world, a teacher would collect her own progress monitoring data so she could listen to to every child read and be able to, understand the kind of errors they're making. But if training a qualified volunteer to come in and do that and give you data that you can be relatively confident in and that the volunteer's gotten the training, and that takes something off the teacher's plate, that's a heck of a lot better than her not taking the data at all, right? And if the time she has is then left to being able to look at it and think about did the student respond this week or not, that's getting us a heck of a lot farther than saying, oh, but it's not being done perfectly, and so we need to focus on that. And I think that's that's the thing that I've been spending a lot of my time thinking about and worrying about in the last couple of years is in well-controlled intervention studies, we can design these things that are very complex and ideal, and schools don't run that way. So we've got to be thinking about how do we create interventions and frameworks for for the schools we have, not the schools we might wish we had, and so that schools are ready to receive them. Um, because I think that's a point of disconnect right now, and I think it's a part of why, not the only reason why, but part of why we see a lag in implementation of evidence-based practices and frameworks like MTSS.
I agree with you. I think we put so much demands on teachers' time that
Hmm.
we forget that their time is truly limited. And,
Hmm.
as I'm putting back my systems hat on, like what is it that you can outsource,
Yep,
so that they can actually focus on teaching.
exactly.
And so those are some of the things that I've thought of over the years.
Absolutely. I think it's really important. I think that so like I would say like and I don't know how you train this, but like that element of pragmatism. Like and maybe so I think a lot of that comes with time and experience, but in terms of the knowledge and skills, especially administrators may need in terms of navigating those negotiable and non-negotiable elements of practice.
Rebecca in the chat, Lori from New Mexico wrote, I think people often stick to familiar practices because change feels uncertain. Even if a
Hmm.
practice is ineffective, the effort to learn and adopt something new can be daunting or have multiple fidelity, or they have multiple fidelity tools that it's hard to keep track.
Yes.
Also, admitting a practice doesn't work can feel like acknowledging failure.
Yes. Oh, there are so many parallels to life in many of those comments. I think that those are all really important. And I would say sort of along those lines, like we've really if we want people to do things, we need to show them how to do them, and I think that there's sometimes this sense that we can give we can adopt a program and say, oh, but it's a script, you can learn it, or tell a para that, right? The teacher gets the training, but the para doesn't, but the para is the one who actually delivers the program. Like, how do we make sure that if we're going to ask you to change your practice, that we're giving you the tools you need to make it happen? And that again, we may need to be creative in how to make that work in a time in a world where we've got limited budgets and resources and time. But if these are the things we're prioritizing, we need to be able to make people put people in situations where they can be successful. And I think along those lines, letting go of the things that are not working. I once worked with a school district that had 42 required assessments. 42. And and I don't think any teacher could have told you the purpose for most of them. And so, when do we pause and say, maybe we pick five and do those well. Um,
Hi,
and
this is Kim from New Mexico. The
Hi,
other
Kim.
thing that I noticed when I was in the school system and working with teachers on monitoring progress for students before referrals were made to special education was that they were collecting the progress monitoring data, but they weren't looking at behaviors.
Hmm.
So they weren't looking at all the other things that occur within a school and disrupt the consistency of
Hmm.
implementing the intervention. Um, they weren't taking attendance into
Hmm.
consideration. They weren't looking, was the student engaged, and all of that. So those were other questions I would constantly
Hmm.
ask them. Okay,
Hmm.
so is this, and this also happening? Is that
Hmm.
why they're not making progress?
Yeah.
So it's like trying to get everybody to change their way of thinking, that it's not just doing the
Hmm.
progress monitoring every Friday and okay, I did it. I don't see any
Put it in
progress.
the file.
Yeah, and put it
Yep.
in a file.
Yep.
But it's changing our way of thinking. And then
Hmm.
we have to take in all these factors into consideration
Yeah.
also.
I think you made one of the things I heard you say that I think is really particularly important and worth repeating is that notion too of getting people to broaden their concept of what counts as behavior. I think often if a child isn't acting out or throwing a chair or hitting other kids, it sort of doesn't seem to count. I'll never forget working with a school team where they were coming up with an intervention plan for a student who's struggling with math, and they said, "Well, every day he comes to math and he falls asleep, but he doesn't have any behavior problems." And, the first thing in my mind is that looks like an avoidance behavior to me, in some way, shape, or form. And so we need to, there's certainly a math issue here, but we also need to deal with, what is going on behaviorally and preceding that math lesson that kind of is contributing to that being the reaction. And
Yeah. And
and
also, as the adults, we also have to reflect on ourselves. How
mhm,
did I implement that intervention?
exactly.
Did I skip steps?
Yep.
Did I implement it with Fidelity?
Yeah.
Did I change it a little
Yeah.
bit so we could get done faster?
Yep.
And it's like Lori said, it's always we look at that. If we look at ourselves and say, oh, I really screwed up and I did this, we see ourselves as failures.
Hmm.
Um, but we have to also look at our behaviors, not just the
Yep.
students.
Yep. Yep. And I would say too, like being able to let go of that we're a failure rather. The data said that didn't work. And sometimes we're going to stumble on things that are really good, right? Hey, I tried this other thing and it worked even better, you know? And if we're taking data on it and if we're working with students for whom we know we need to intensify and adjust the program and our data are supporting the decisions that we're making, then, it it that's what we're having fidelity to and not to necessarily a predetermined checklist. We want to rule out that the checklist isn't enough first, but then we need to think about fidelity to what we're moving toward and being open to making changes when our data tells us that. So it is a Friday afternoon or maybe morning if you're on the West Coast, and I know we are just at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I'm happy to stay if people have other comments before. But if you need to sign off, please feel free. It's nice to see all of you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really
Thank you.
appreciate the
Of
time you
course.
took to put together this presentation and bring it to our Fidelity Friday. So that you know and the people in our audience know, I will process this recording and send out your slides and access to the recording early next week.
Excellent. Thank you all. Hope you have
Thanks.
something fun and relaxing you can enjoy over the weekend. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.